10:45 in the morning on November 24, 1944, 111 Boeing B-29 Superfortress bombers approached Tokyo from the south at 30,000 feet. It was the first American bombing raid on the Japanese capital since the Doolittle raid 2.5 years earlier. The mission was codenamed San Antonio 1. Brigadier General Emmett O'Donnell, Jr. flew as mission command pilot in the B-29 named Dauntless Dottie. Of the 111 bombers that took off from Isley Field on Saipan, only 88 actually dropped bombs on Tokyo. Weather over the target was terrible. Cloud cover obscured the primary target, the Nakajima aircraft factory at Musashino. Most bombers had to bomb by radar rather than visual sighting. The bombing results were poor. Only 24 bombers hit the primary target. But the appearance of the superfortresses over the Japanese capital sent a clear message. American air power was now within reach of the home islands, and there was nothing Japan could do to stop it. Japanese fighter pilots scrambled from airfields around Tokyo. They climbed as hard as their aircraft would allow. Most reached 22,000 to 24,000 feet before their engines began to lose power in the thin air. The B-29s flew 6,000 to 8,000 feet above them, silver shapes moving steadily through the sky, completely out of reach. The Japanese pilots pushed their throttles to maximum power. Their engines screamed. The controls felt mushy. Some fighters wallowed at the edge of their performance envelope, barely able to maneuver. A few pilots tried firing their guns at extreme range. The rounds fell short. The Americans had built a bomber that flew higher than most Japanese fighters could effectively reach, and there was nothing conventional tactics could do about it. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress was unlike any bomber the world had ever seen. It had a service ceiling of 33,600 feet. It could fly at 357 miles per hour at altitude. It carried 20,000 pounds of bombs over a combat radius of 1,600 miles. And most importantly, it operated at altitudes where Japanese fighters struggled to function. The B-29 was the most expensive weapons program of World War II, costing $3 billion to develop and produce. That was more than the Manhattan Project. Boeing had designed the aircraft with pressurized crew compartments, allowing the crew to function at high altitude without oxygen masks in most sections. The aircraft had remote-controlled gun turrets operated by a sophisticated fire control system. 4 12.7mm machine guns in the tail, 4 in the upper forward turret, 4 in the upper rear turret, and 2 in the lower forward turret gave the bomber formidable defensive firepower. But the B-29 was far from perfect. Engine fires plagued early operations. The Wright R3350 engines were powerful but temperamental. Mechanics struggled with cooling problems and cylinder failures. The engine fire extinguishing system failed 87% of the time during early operations. Many crews feared the aircraft's engines more than they feared Japanese fighters. In the first months of operations, more B-29s were lost to mechanical failures than to enemy action. The Japanese Army Air Force had built its fighter force around dogfighting. Aircraft like the Kai-43 Hayabusa and the famous A-6M0 were designed for maneuverability at low and medium altitudes. They could turn inside anything the Allies flew below 20,000 feet. But at 30,000 feet, these fighters lost power, lost speed, and lost the ability to climb. The air was too thin, the engines choked, the controls barely responded. The Kai-44 Shoki was Japan's primary high-altitude interceptor, designed specifically for fast climbing. Its maximum service ceiling was 36,750 feet, which meant it could theoretically reach B-29 operating altitudes. But theory and combat reality were vastly different. Climbing to 30,000 feet took enormous time and fuel. At that altitude, the thin air robbed the aircraft of speed and maneuverability. Guns frequently jammed in the extreme cold. Engines overheated under maximum power settings. And even when everything worked perfectly, pilots faced formations of heavily armed bombers. The Kai-44 represented a significant departure from traditional Japanese fighter design philosophy. Where the Zero emphasized maneuverability over speed, the Kai-44 prioritized climb rate and high-altitude performance. It was powered by the Nakajima Ha 109 14-cylinder radial engine producing 1,519 horsepower. The aircraft could climb to 16,000 feet in 5 minutes under ideal conditions, but sustaining that climb rate to 30,000 feet was another matter. The engine consumed fuel at an unsustainable rate at maximum power. Pilots had perhaps 10 to 15 minutes at high altitude before they had to descend or risk running out of fuel before reaching base. The Kai-44's armament varied by model. The most common version carried 4 12.7mm Ho 103 machine guns. Some later models were equipped with 240mm Ho, 301 cannons, specifically for attacking B-29s. These cannons used caseless ammunition and had a low muzzle velocity, making them effective only at close range. But getting close enough to use them was the problem. The cannons added weight that degraded the aircraft's already marginal high-altitude performance. The Ki-84 Hayate was Japan's newest and best fighter. Its service ceiling was 34,450 feet, and it had better high-altitude performance than earlier designs. The aircraft was powered by the Nakajima Ha 45 18-cylinder radial engine producing 2,000 horsepower. On paper, the Ki-84 could match or exceed the performance of American P-51 Mustangs at medium altitudes. It was fast, well armed with two 12.7mm machine guns and two 20mm cannons, and relatively well armored for a Japanese fighter. But even the Ki-84 struggled at 30,000 feet. The aircraft performed well at medium altitudes but lost effectiveness in the thin air above. Pilots reported that their controls felt sluggish, their guns jammed, and their engines overheated under sustained maximum power. Manufacturing quality also declined as the war progressed. Later production, Ki-84s suffered from substandard materials and poor quality control. Fuel shortages forced the use of lower-octane gasoline that reduced engine performance. The technological gap was simply too wide. Japan couldn't build an engine that could deliver sustained high power at extreme altitude without overheating or failing. American doctrine for B-29 operations was simple. Fly high, stay in formation, use speed and altitude as defense. The bombers didn't need to outmaneuver Japanese fighters, they just needed to stay above them, and it worked. In the first month of operations from the Mariana Islands, Japanese fighters accounted for less than 10% of B-29 losses. Most bombers that went down were lost to mechanical failures or accidents, not enemy action. Japanese commanders knew they had a problem. In November 1944, Japan had only 375 operational fighters assigned to defend the entire home islands. This included every type of fighter, from obsolete trainers pressed into service to the handful of modern Ki-84 fighters just entering production. Against this force, the Americans were preparing to send waves of B-29s numbering in the hundreds. The operational losses were devastating. Between November 1944 and January 1945, Japanese fighter units lost dozens of aircraft attempting to intercept B-29 formations. Most losses came not from combat with bombers, but from engine failures at high altitude, accidents during emergency landings, and simple exhaustion of pilots pushing inadequate aircraft beyond their design limits. The Ki-44's Nakajima Ha 109 engine had chronic cooling problems that became critical at high-altitude interceptions. The engine's magnesium alloy components were used to save weight, but they made the engine prone to fires. Pilots learned to watch their cylinder head temperature gauges obsessively. If the temperature climbed too high, they had to throttle back or risk engine failure. But throttling back at 30,000 feet meant falling behind the bomber formation. It was an impossible choice. Push the engine and risk mechanical failure, or throttle back and lose the target. Ki-45. Toryuu twin-engine heavy fighters were slower than the Bei-29s at altitude and struggled to close the distance. The Kawasaki Ha 112 engines produced 1,080 horsepower each, giving the Ki-45 good performance at medium altitudes. But at 30,000 feet, the twin engines couldn't generate enough power to catch a B-29 flying at cruising speed. Some Ki-45 units tried positioning fighters ahead of predicted bomber routes and diving on the formations from above. This tactic occasionally worked, but it required accurate intelligence on bomber routes and timing. Japanese radar coverage was incomplete, and the few radar sets available lacked the precision to vector fighters accurately. The 53rd Sentai, which operated Ki-45 night fighters, lost 11 aircraft attempting to intercept B-29s in December 1944 and January 1945. 7 were lost to engine failures at high altitude. 3 were lost to accidents during emergency landings after failed interceptions. 1 pilot disappeared, presumably crashing in the mountains while trying to chase bombers he couldn't reach. The unit's night interception equipment, copied from German designs, was unreliable and difficult to maintain. Airborne radar sets were heavy, reducing aircraft performance. The few aircraft equipped with radar had even worse high-altitude performance than standard fighters. Even when fighters reached the bomber formations, their guns often jammed in the extreme cold. At 30,000 feet, temperatures dropped to minus 40 degrees Celsius or lower. Gun lubricants froze. Firing mechanisms seized. Ammunition feeds jammed. Some pilots tried using special cold weather lubricants, but supplies were limited and the lubricants themselves had problems. Too light, and they evaporated. Too heavy, and they thickened in the cold. Finding the right balance was nearly impossible. Pilots watched rounds fall short of their targets. Japanese fighters typically carried 20-millimeter cannons and 12.7-millimeter machine guns. The cannons had effective ranges of perhaps 400 to 600 meters. But at 30,000 feet in thin air, ballistics changed. Rounds dropped more quickly due to lack of air resistance. Tracer patterns looked different. What worked at low altitude didn't work at high altitude. Pilots had to relearn everything about gunnery. Many never got the chance. They were shot down before they could gain the experience. By mid-February 1945, Japanese commanders were desperate. Standard intercept tactics weren't working. Fighters couldn't reach the B-29s reliably. When they did reach altitude, they couldn't fight effectively. The thin air robbed them of speed and maneuverability. Their guns froze or jammed, their engines overheated or failed. And even when everything worked perfectly, they faced formations of heavily armed bombers with 12.7-millimeter machine guns and remotely controlled turrets. The statistics were devastating. In January 1945, Japanese fighters attempted over 200 interceptions of B-29 formations. They achieved fewer than 40 successful attacks, meaning attacks where fighters actually got close enough to fire their guns. Of those 40 attacks, only 3 resulted in B-29s shot down. The ratio was unacceptable. Japan was losing pilots and aircraft at an unsustainable rate for almost no gain. But someone had already found a solution, though not through official channels. On August 20th, 1944, during a raid on the Yawata Steelworks, Sergeant Shio Nobe of the 4th Sentai deliberately rammed his Kai-45 into a B-29 named Gertrude C. The impact destroyed both aircraft. Debris from the collision severely damaged a second B-29, Calamity Sue, which also went down. Sergeant Nobe and his gunner, Sergeant Denzo Takagi, were both killed. All crew members of both B-29s died. It was the first recorded ramming attack against B-29s. Word of Nobe's action spread quickly through Japanese fighter units. On November 6th and 7th, 1944, the 10th Air Division commander issued orders that changed Japanese air defense tactics. All fighter units defending the home islands were directed to form Shinten Seikutai, or heaven-shaking air superiority units. These were specialized flights of 4 aircraft within each fighter unit, specifically designated for ramming attacks against B-29s. The directive was specific about organization and tactics. Each Shinten Seikutai flight would consist of 4 aircraft and 4 pilots, specially selected for the mission. The pilots had to be experienced, physically fit, and psychologically prepared for the reality of deliberately crashing their aircraft into enemy bombers. Aircraft were to be modified by removing unnecessary equipment to reduce weight and improve climb performance. Wing-mounted fuel tanks were removed, some armor plate was stripped out, ammunition loads were reduced since the primary weapon was the aircraft itself. The training emphasized 3 critical skills. First, climbing to intercept altitude as quickly as possible while conserving fuel. Second, identifying the best target within a bomber formation, typically aircraft on the edges of the formation that could be isolated. Third, executing the ram attack with enough force to destroy the bomber while giving the pilot a chance to survive. The technique required diving to build up speed, then pulling up sharply into the bomber. The fighter's wing would strike the bomber's tail section or wing structure. If done correctly, the impact would disable the bomber without completely destroying the attacking fighter. The concept was controversial. Some commanders saw it as wasteful and desperate. How could Japan afford to lose fighters and trained pilots in what amounted to semi-suicidal attacks? Others pointed out that conventional attacks were achieving almost nothing. B-29s were destroying Japanese cities with impunity. Something had to be done, even if that something was desperate. The debate raged through military headquarters in Tokyo, but frontline commanders didn't wait for permission. They began forming ramming units immediately. The ramming attacks were not suicide missions in the strict sense. Pilots were trained to strike the bomber in a way that would disable it while giving themselves a chance to bail out or crash land their damaged aircraft. The target was usually the tail section, or wing. The attacking pilot would dive to build up speed, then pull up sharply into the bomber. If executed correctly, the fighter's wing would strike the bomber's control surfaces, disabling it. The pilot might survive. Survival was possible, but not guaranteed. The technique required precise timing and extraordinary courage. The pilot had to judge his approach angle perfectly. Too steep and he would simply crash through the bomber, destroying both aircraft and killing himself. Too shallow and he would bounce off or miss entirely. The ideal angle was roughly 30 to 40 degrees, striking the bomber's tail or wing structure with the fighter's wingtip or outer wing section. This would tear away critical control surfaces while allowing the fighter's fuselage to pass by relatively intact. Pilots practiced the maneuver repeatedly during training, though obviously without actual contact. They used visual markers to judge distance and angle. They learned to estimate closure rates. They studied B-29 structure to identify vulnerable points. The tail section was preferred because it was relatively fragile and contained the elevator and rudder controls. Destroying these made the bomber uncontrollable. Wing strikes were riskier because the wing structure was stronger, but a solid hit could rupture fuel tanks or damage engines. The psychological preparation was perhaps the most difficult aspect. Pilots had to overcome every instinct that told them not to fly directly at another aircraft. They had to maintain focus while knowing they might die in seconds. They had to commit fully to the attack, or it wouldn't work. Half-hearted attempts resulted in glancing blows that damaged neither aircraft significantly. Only a committed, precisely executed ram had a chance of success. The most successful ramming unit was the 244th Sentai, commanded by Captain Teruhiko Kobayashi. The unit was based at Chofu Airfield west of Tokyo and was responsible for the capital's air defense. On December 3, 1944, a formation of B-29s approached Tokyo. Kobayashi led his unit in a coordinated ramming attack that would become legendary in Japanese military history. The attack was carefully planned and precisely executed. Kobayashi had positioned his fighters at staggered altitudes along the predicted bomber approach path. When the B-29s appeared, the fighters already had altitude and position. They didn't need to waste time in fuel climbing to intercept. Each pilot selected a target. At Kobayashi's command, they dove on the formation almost simultaneously. The first ramming occurred at approximately 10:30 in the morning. A Kai 61 from the 244th struck a B-29's tail section. The bomber's vertical stabilizers separated from the fuselage. The B-29 went into an uncontrollable spin. Within minutes, 5 more B-29s were struck by ramming attacks. The coordination was remarkable. The bombers had no time to react or take evasive action. They fell out of formation one after another. The 244th Sentai claimed 6 B-29s destroyed that day, all through ramming attacks. Miraculously, every Japanese pilot survived. Some bailed out, some crash-landed their damaged fighters, all were recovered. It was an unprecedented success, and it proved that ramming tactics could work if properly organized and executed. Kobayashi himself scored 3 B-29 kills during the war using ramming tactics. He received the Bukusho, the second class of the Order of the Golden Kite, for his actions. It was Japan's highest military honor that could be awarded to living soldiers. Kobayashi was 24 years old, making him the youngest Sentai commander in the Japanese Army Air Force. He was born in 1920 and had graduated from the Imperial Japanese Army Academy in the 53rd class in 1940. His rapid promotion reflected both his exceptional flying skills and his leadership abilities. Kobayashi understood that the altitude problem made conventional interceptions nearly futile. He trained his pilots in ramming tactics not out of fanaticism, but out of cold tactical calculation. It was the only method that gave Japanese fighters a reasonable chance of destroying B-29s. The December 3rd attack was carefully planned. Kobayashi positioned his unit's fighters at different altitudes along the predicted bomber approach path. When the B-29s appeared, the fighters already had altitude and didn't need to waste time in fuel climbing. They dove on the formation from above, building up speed. Each pilot selected a target and executed the ramming attack almost simultaneously. The coordination was remarkable. The bombers had no time to react. 6 B-29s fell out of formation in the space of minutes. Every pilot in Kobayashi's unit survived that mission. They had practiced the technique repeatedly. They knew exactly where to strike the bombers and how to pull away at the last moment. Some pilots hit the tail section and then kicked their rudder hard to slide their aircraft past rather than plowing straight through. Others struck wings at precisely calculated angles that destroyed the bomber's structure while deflecting the fighter away. It was extraordinarily dangerous, but it worked. The pilots parachuted or crashed, landed their damaged fighters, and were recovered. Kobayashi received the Bukosho, the second class of the Order of the Golden Kite, for his actions. It was Japan's highest military honor that could be awarded to living soldiers. The decoration recognized not just his personal bravery, but his innovation in developing tactics that actually worked against the B-29s. He continued leading the 244th Sentai through the rest of the war, shooting down a total of 5 confirmed aircraft, including 3 B-29s and 2 F-6F Hellcats. After the war, Kobayashi joined the Japan Air Self-Defense Force when it was established in 1954. He became a training instructor at the flight training school. He rose to the rank of lieutenant colonel and was known for his strict discipline and emphasis on tactical thinking rather than just flying skill. He told his students repeatedly that courage without tactical intelligence was worthless. He emphasized understanding the capabilities and limitations of both your own aircraft and the enemy's. He was widely respected by the new generation of Japanese pilots. Tragically, Kobayashi was killed in a T-33 training accident on May 15, 1957. He was flying a training mission with a student pilot when the aircraft suffered a mechanical failure. Kobayashi could have ejected, but chose to stay with the aircraft to help the student. Both were killed when the aircraft crashed. He was 37 years old. His funeral was attended by hundreds of pilots, both former wartime comrades and post-war students. He was remembered not as a fanatic, but as a professional officer who did what was necessary under impossible circumstances. The 47th Sentai at Narimasu Airfield also formed a Shinten Seikotai ramming unit. Captain Teiichi Hatano commanded the unit's specialized ramming flight. Hatano was an experienced fighter pilot who volunteered for the dangerous assignment. He selected his pilots carefully. All were experienced. All understood the mission. All volunteered. A group photograph taken on November 7, 1944, shows Hatano and his pilots standing in front of their modified Ki 44 fighters. Master Sergeant Isamu Sakamoto was one of Hatano's pilots in the 47th Sentai. On January 27, 1945, Sakamoto executed a ramming attack against a B-29. His Kai 44's wing struck the bomber's tail section. The vertical stabilizer broke off. The B-29 went into an uncontrollable spin and crashed. Sakamoto's aircraft lost half its right wing. He managed to roll the aircraft level and bail out. He landed in a rice paddy and was recovered by ground forces. He received the Bukosho for his action and survived the war. Lieutenant Heikichi Yoshizawa, also of the 47th Sentai, attempted a ramming attack on February 10, 1945, during a B-29 raid on Ota. Yoshizawa flew his Ki 44 inverted toward the bomber formation, rolled upright at the last moment, and deliberately struck a B-29 from above. His aircraft's nose hit the bomber's left wing between the number 1 and number 2 engines. The wing structure failed. The B-29 fell out of formation. Yoshizawa was killed instantly in the collision. His sacrifice was honored by his unit, and his family received recognition for his bravery. Warrant Officer Kenji Fujimoto of the 246th Sentai became one of the most successful ramming pilots. He was credited with 3 B-29s destroyed through ramming attacks, an extraordinary accomplishment. His first ramming attack occurred on March 13, 1945. He struck a B-29 from the 499th Bomb Group. His aircraft was heavily damaged, but he survived. On March 16, 1945, Fujimoto executed his second ramming attack over Kobe. Again, his aircraft was severely damaged. Again, he survived. He was awarded the Bukosho after this second successful ramming. Fujimoto continued flying combat missions through the end of the war. Tragically, he was killed on August 14, 1945, the last day of the war, when his Ki-84 was shot down by Captain Douglas V. Curry's P-47N. He was one of the last Japanese pilots to die in combat. Captain Makoto Ogawa of the 70th Sentai took a different approach entirely. Ogawa was born in February 1917 in Shizuoka Prefecture. He enlisted in the Army at age 18 and was assigned to the 7th Air Regiment based at Hamamatsu Airfield in his home prefecture. He enrolled in the Kumagaya Army Flying School and graduated in August 1938 as a member of the 72nd class of students. He was assigned to the 70th Sentai in late 1941 and flew operations in Manchuria against Soviet and Chinese forces before being transferred to Kashiwa Airfield near Tokyo in November 1944 for B-29 defense. Ogawa specialized in night interceptions, using conventional tactics rather than ramming. He was exceptionally skilled at using the darkness to his advantage. B-29 formations were easier to spot at night than individual fighters. The bomber's exhausts glowed visibly against the dark sky. Ogawa would climb to altitude ahead of the predicted bomber route and wait. When the formation appeared, he would position his Ki-84 beneath the bombers and fire upward into their vulnerable bellies. The technique required extraordinary skill and nervousness. At night, at high altitude, with limited visibility, Ogawa had to judge distance and angle precisely. Too far away, and his guns were ineffective. Too close, and he risked colliding with the bomber or being hit by its defensive fire. He had to account for the relative motion of both aircraft. He had to fire a burst and then immediately break away before the bomber's gunners could track him. It was like hunting in three-dimensional space in near darkness, while both hunter and prey were moving at hundreds of miles per hour. Ogawa shot down 7 B-29s using these gunnery attacks. His first kill came in December 1944. He positioned beneath a bomber, fired a 3-second burst from his two 20mm cannons and two 12.7mm machine guns, and watched the bomber's number 3 engine explode. The B-29 fell out of formation, trailing fire. Ogawa didn't wait to see it crash. He was already looking for his next target. His technique became more refined with experience. He learned to target specific areas of the B-29. The wing route where fuel tanks were located was particularly vulnerable. A hit there often caused catastrophic fires. He learned to wait until he was within 200 meters before firing. Any farther, and his accuracy suffered. He learned to fire in short bursts to avoid overheating his guns or wasting ammunition. Each lesson was learned through trial and error, and the price of error was often death. When his ammunition ran out on several occasions, Ogawa attempted ramming attacks, though none were successful. He got close enough to strike bombers twice, but both times his aircraft took damage from the bombers' defensive fire before he could execute the ram. He managed to return to base both times. Though his aircraft was written off after the second incident, he was assigned a new Kai-84 and continued flying missions. Ogawa also shot down two P-51 Mustangs, giving him a total confirmed score of 9 aircraft. The P-51s were a completely different challenge than B-29s. They were fast, maneuverable, and flown by well-trained pilots. Ogawa engaged them twice in daylight combat and managed to shoot down both, though he took damage in both encounters. His Kai-84 was arguably the best fighter Japan had, but the P-51s were superior in most respects. Ogawa's victories reflected his skill more than any advantage in equipment. Ogawa was the highest-scoring B-29 killer in the 70th Sentai. He received the Bukosho on July 9, 1945, just a month before the war ended. He survived the war and returned to Shizuoka Prefecture. He never flew again. He refused all interviews about his combat experiences for decades. When he finally spoke about the war in the 1980s, he expressed no pride in his record. He said he was simply doing his duty. He said the ramming tactics were born of desperation and that the war was already lost by the time the B-29s arrived. He worked as a businessman in Tokyo and died in the early 2000s. The Americans noticed the change in tactics immediately. B-29 crews began reporting fighters deliberately ramming their aircraft. The first reports were met with skepticism. American intelligence officers thought the Japanese pilots were accidentally colliding with bombers during aggressive attacks. But as more incidents occurred, it became clear the attacks were deliberate and systematically organized. B-29 crews reported seeing Japanese fighters dive away from formations, build up speed, then pull up sharply to strike bombers from below or from the side. The attacks targeted tail sections and wing structures. When successful, the bomber would lose control and fall out of formation. Sometimes the attacking pilot survived. Often he didn't, but the pattern was unmistakable. These were not accidents. They were coordinated tactical attacks. The ramming attacks created psychological pressure on American bomber crews. Pilots and crew members knew that Japanese fighters were willing to deliberately crash into them. The knowledge that an enemy pilot might sacrifice his own life to destroy your aircraft was unsettling. Some crews requested transfers to other units. Others pushed through and continued flying missions. The fear was real. The threat was real. And there was no defense except flying higher and faster, which the B-29s were already doing. But the ramming tactics came at a tremendous cost to Japan. The 244th Sentai's success on December 3, 1944, was exceptional. Most ramming attacks were less successful. Pilots missed their targets. Bombers sustained damage but stayed airborne. Attacking fighters crashed without striking their intended victim. The survival rate varied greatly depending on how and where the fighter struck the bomber. Between November 1944 and June 1945, Japanese fighter units conducted ramming attacks throughout the home island's air defense campaign. While exact numbers are difficult to verify, estimates suggest approximately 130 ramming attempts were made. Of these, roughly 37 resulted in B-29s destroyed or seriously damaged, but the cost was severe. Japan lost fighters and trained pilots at a rate it couldn't sustain. The mathematics were brutal. Even successful ramming attacks often cost Japan more than they gained. A single B-29 might be destroyed, but the fighter was lost and the pilot killed or seriously injured. American factories were producing hundreds of B-29s. Japanese factories were struggling to build 50 fighters per month. The exchange rate was unsustainable. Japan was hemorrhaging experienced pilots faster than they could be replaced. By late April 1945, another factor changed the equation entirely. American P-51 Mustang fighters began escorting B-29 missions from Iwo Jima. The P-51s had captured the island in March after a brutal month-long battle that cost over 26,000 American casualties. The battle was fought specifically to provide emergency landing fields for damaged B-29s and bases for escort fighters. By early April, the first fighter units were operational from the island's airfields. The P-51s could fly at 30,000 feet with ease. The North American P-51D Mustang was powered by the Packard Buff 1650 Merlin engine producing 1,490 horsepower. With drop tanks, the aircraft had a combat radius of approximately 750 miles, enough to escort B-29s to targets in Japan and return to Iwo Jima. The P-51 had a service ceiling of 41,900 feet, giving it a substantial altitude advantage over Japanese fighters. It could fly faster, climb faster, and fight more effectively at high altitude than anything Japan could field. More importantly, the P-51s could hunt down Japanese fighters before they reached the bomber formations. Japanese ramming attacks required careful positioning. Pilots had to climb to altitude, position themselves relative to the bomber formation, dive to build up speed, and then execute the ramming attack. This entire process took time and left the fighters vulnerable. The P-51s disrupted the process at every stage. Japanese pilots found themselves fighting for their lives against American escort fighters before they could even attempt to attack the bombers. American fighter pilots quickly learned Japanese tactics. They recognized when Japanese fighters were positioning for ramming attacks. They intercepted them during the climb or during the positioning phase. The P-51s had superior speed and altitude performance. They could dictate the terms of engagement. Japanese pilots who attempted to position themselves for ramming attacks were shot down by escort fighters long before they could reach the bomber formations. The few who did reach the bombers found themselves attacked by P-51s immediately after executing the ram, giving them no chance to escape. On April 7, 1945, 119 P-51s of the 7th Fighter Command escorted B-29s to attack the Nakajima aircraft factory at Musashino near Tokyo. It was the first long-range escort mission from Iwo Jima, and it changed everything. Japanese fighters attempted to intercept, but were engaged by the Mustangs before reaching the bombers. 12 Japanese fighters were shot down. 3 P-51s were lost. Only 2 B-29s suffered damage, both from anti-aircraft fire rather than fighter attack. The 7th Fighter Command received the Distinguished Unit Citation for this mission. The mission demonstrated conclusively that Japanese air defenses could not cope with coordinated bomber and fighter operations. The B-29s already flew too high for effective interception. Adding high-performance escort fighters made any interception suicidal. Japanese commanders recognized that continuing to contest B-29 raids would simply accelerate the destruction of Japan's remaining fighter force, a force that was desperately needed for the expected American invasion of the home islands. By mid-May 1945, American air operations over Japan had reached overwhelming proportions. Hundreds of B-29s struck targets every few days. P-51s swept ahead of the bombers, attacking any Japanese fighters that attempted to take off. Naval carrier aircraft struck coastal targets and airfields. Japan's air defense network was collapsing. Radar stations had been destroyed. Communications were disrupted. Fuel shortages grounded many fighters. Pilot quality had declined catastrophically as experienced pilots were killed and replaced with inadequately trained recruits. On May 29, 1945, 454 B-29s attacked Yokohama, escorted by over 100 P-51 Mustangs. It was one of the largest coordinated missions of the war. Japanese fighters attempted to intercept. They were met by the Mustangs. 26 Japanese fighters were shot down in the resulting air battle. Most were destroyed before they could reach the bomber formation. A few broke through and attempted attacks on the bombers, but the B-29 gunners and remaining P-51s drove them off. 5 B-29s were lost during the mission, but none to ramming attacks. 3 were shot down by anti-aircraft fire. 1 suffered a mechanical failure and ditched in the ocean. 1 collided with another bomber during formation assembly. The P-51s had effectively neutralized the ramming threat completely. Japanese pilots who attempted to position themselves for ramming attacks were shot down systematically. The survival rate for our Japanese fighter pilots dropped to nearly zero. It wasn't just that they couldn't destroy B-29s anymore. They couldn't even attempt attacks without being killed themselves. After the May 29th mission, Japanese commanders made a difficult decision. Fighter units would no longer attempt to intercept B-29 formations except under the most favorable conditions. The losses were too high. The results were too limited. Japan's remaining fighters would be held in reserve for the expected American invasion of the home islands. It was an admission of complete defeat in the air war. The skies over Japan belonged to the Americans now. B-29s could strike any target at will. There was no defense. There was no hope of defense. On June 15, 1945, 444 B-29s attacked Osaka. Not a single Japanese fighter rose to intercept them. American bomber crews flew over the city unopposed. The Japanese had effectively conceded control of the air. The B-29s could now strike any target in Japan with impunity. The altitude advantage that had begun the campaign was now reinforced by numerical superiority and fighter escorts that made any Japanese response suicidal. The official Japanese report on air defense operations from April through June 1945 made for grim reading. In 3 months, Japanese fighter units had lost over 300 aircraft attempting to defend against B-29 raids. Most were lost to mechanical failures, accidents during high-altitude operations, or combat with American escort fighters. Only a small percentage of losses resulted in B-29s destroyed. The kill ratio was approximately 1 B-29 for every 8 Japanese fighters lost. The report concluded that conventional fighter defense of the home islands was no longer feasible. Japanese fighters could not effectively reach the altitude where B-29s operated. When they did reach altitude, they could not fight effectively. The introduction of American escort fighters made even desperate ramming attacks nearly impossible. The recommendation was to preserve remaining fighters for ground attack missions during the expected invasion of the home islands. From the beginning of B-29 operations on November 24th, 1944 to the end of the war on August 15th, 1945, the 20th Air Force, operating from the Mariana Islands, lost 447 B-29s and 824 crews. Of these losses, 343 aircraft, or 1.2% of those airborne, were lost to enemy action. Japanese fighters accounted for 13% of all battle damage to B-29s. 76% of battle damage was from anti-aircraft fire. The remaining damage was from various causes, including weather and mechanical failures. In the same period, Japanese fighter units defending the home islands lost approximately 1,200 aircraft and over 800 pilots. The majority of these losses occurred during attempts to intercept high-altitude B-29 formations. The exchange ratio heavily favored the Americans. For every B-29 shot down by Japanese fighters, Japan lost multiple fighters and irreplaceable experienced pilots. The B-29's altitude capability wasn't a secret weapon. Japanese intelligence knew the specifications. Japanese engineers understood the problem. Japan simply couldn't build an interceptor that could fight at 30,000 feet and win. The technology gap was too wide. The industrial capacity gap was too wide. American factories produced nearly 4,000 B-29s during the war. Japanese factories produced less than 11,000 fighters of all types in the same period. The ramming tactics used by units like the 244th Sentai under Captain Kobayashi and the 47th Sentai under Captain Hatano represented incredible bravery and desperation in equal measure. These pilots knew they were flying obsolete or inadequate aircraft against a technologically superior enemy. They knew their chances of survival were low. They flew anyway because it was the only option left. Many died trying. Some, like Master Sergeant Sakamoto and Warrant Officer Fujimoto, survived multiple ramming attacks through a combination of skill, luck, and sheer determination. But bravery couldn't overcome altitude. Courage couldn't defeat engineering. Japan's fighters were excellent aircraft at low and medium altitudes. The Kai-44 could climb quickly. The Ki-84 was fast and well-armed. The Zero was legendary for its maneuverability. None of that mattered at 30,000 feet. At that altitude, Japanese fighters lost power, lost speed, and lost effectiveness, and the B-29s stayed at 30,000 feet. Captain Makoto Ogawa survived the war and spoke about his experiences in later years. He said the B-29 was the most formidable aircraft he ever faced, not because of its weapons, but because Japanese fighters simply couldn't reach it reliably. He said the ramming tactics were born of desperation, not strategy. He felt no pride in his combat record. He said sending pilots to deliberately crash their aircraft was a sign of how badly Japan was losing the war. Captain Teruhiko Kobayashi survived the war and joined the Japan Air Self-Defense Force. He became a training instructor and rose to the rank of lieutenant colonel. He trained a generation of post-war Japanese pilots, emphasizing technical skill and tactical discipline. He told his students about the ramming attacks not as acts of heroism, but as examples of what happens when pilots are forced to compensate for inadequate equipment with personal courage. He was killed in a T-33 training accident on May 15, 1957. He was 37 years old. Warrant Officer Kenji Fujimoto never had the chance to reflect on his experiences. He died on August 14, 1945, the last day of the war. He had survived 3 ramming attacks against B-29s. He had received the Bukusho for his bravery. He had done everything his country asked of him. And in the end, he was shot down by an American fighter pilot in the final hours of the war. His sacrifice, like that of so many Japanese pilots, was ultimately futile. The war was already lost. The B-29s had already broken Japan's ability to continue fighting. The B-29 had one overwhelming advantage that no amount of Japanese skill or courage could overcome. It flew higher than Japanese fighters could effectively reach. Despite the aircraft's own problems, engine fires, mechanical failures, and design flaws, the altitude advantage proved decisive. Japanese fighters could theoretically reach those altitudes but couldn't fight effectively once there. The thin air, the extreme cold, the fuel consumption, the engine, stress all combined to make high-altitude interception nearly impossible. That advantage proved decisive. By mid-1945, Japan's cities were burning. Industrial production had collapsed. Food supplies were running out. The submarine blockade and the B-29 campaign had strangled the Japanese economy. When the atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, they were delivered by B-29s. But the atomic bombs were only the final blow. The conventional bombing campaign had already broken Japan's ability to continue the war. The altitude superiority of the B-29 made effective fighter defense of the home islands impossible. Japanese commanders knew this by March 1945, but had no alternative. The ramming tactics represented a last desperate attempt to inflict casualties on an enemy that was systematically destroying Japanese cities from altitudes Japanese fighters couldn't consistently reach. The decision to stop contesting B-29 raids in June 1945 was an admission of complete defeat in the air war. The lesson of the B-29 campaign is simple and brutal. In modern war, technological advantage matters more than courage. Japanese pilots were among the most skilled and dedicated aviators in history. Men like Captain Kobayashi, Captain Ogawa, Master Sergeant Sakamoto, and Warrant Officer Fujimoto displayed extraordinary bravery. But skill and dedication couldn't overcome the fundamental limitation of their aircraft. The B-29s flew too high. Japanese fighters couldn't reach them effectively. Everything else followed from that single fact. If you found this story as compelling as we did, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. And we would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans from Texas to Tasmania. From veterans to history enthusiasts, you are part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive